So wanted to, jump into the real low code component of this. So, every organization does security a different way. They have different departments. They have different communications methodologies. So what we're going to show is, using Swimlane, we're going to show a use case that we as a vendor would never build. Like this is not a use case that, we would ship out to every customer on the planet because it's really specific to an organization. So, to kind of kick off here, so I'm supposed to reintroduce myself. So we're going to do a low-code security automation for cross-departmental security use cases. I'm Cody Cornell. I'm the co-founder of Swimlane, and I'm with Bryon Page, who is our director of solution architecture. So board meeting number 3. We'll jump in here and we'll talk a little bit about how this is progressing. So we're still doing phishing use cases. We're still getting a lot of phishing emails that are coming in, but we're getting more accurate as users in reporting them. But they're still coming in, but now our response time is down to minutes. That's a huge, again, value add. Obviously, as part of that last quarter, we sent a fraudulent invoice to a customer. So now we're on the hook for filling out a third-party vendor assessment again. So, where does that data come from? What tools do you have in place? What processes and procedures do you have in place? A lot of that actually is stored inside of a system like Swimlane. Again, that being able to use low code to codify processes allows you to even export and screenshot those processes to show customers, partners, whoever's asking that you actually are doing this and have a way of doing it. So Bryon was able to show how we implemented that credential monitoring service. And what happened is we got down to the what we think was the root cause of the credential compromise. You have a user that doesn't typically travel, but did travel to attend a conference. And generally, you'll see security policies from an endpoint perspective and a user perspective applied differently to folks that travel and don't travel. And while they weren't able to actually, go find the log or whatever it was that the compromise would be kind of red flagged as, but they basically suspected that hotel Wi-Fi, which is not abnormal, right? Connecting to hotel Wi-Fi, credential compromise. So what they realized is they had a breakdown in process between folks that decided to travel that don't typically travel and security's kind of ability to monitor them when they don't have the infrastructure kind of around them when they're out on the road. So the goal was to implement a process that would actually allow HR and security to collaborate that was initiated by HR to change the security posture and the policies associated with the user during that, before they actually hit the road. So we'll pass it over to Bryon here and we'll kind of walk through this. And this is, we can actually show the forms and the workflow and how this was created.
Perfect. Thank you, Cody. Okay, so essentially what's happening is we've connected to Bank Mega's HR platform. So essentially, when somebody does go to travel, they're going to open up a ticket in the HR platform, and then Swimlane's going to be monitoring that for that particular type of travel request. We'll then create a case in Swimlane, and with those details, as soon as it comes in, we're then going to just go ahead and reach out to our IDP to understand, who is the user. We can tie into our DLP and also our UEBA, or user entity and behavioral analytics tools, to understand, is there a risk score associated with them? Are they a VIP? If they are, what group are they a member of? What's their current status for multi-factor authentication, et cetera? And then, of course, just some high-level details of where exactly are they going to be traveling, right? And so from an analyst perspective, I kind of have all the data. But then the next question is, well, from a policy enforcement perspective, I need to check multiple tools to understand what is that current status, right? So from a policy status perspective, if they're doing international travel, I need to know, is encryption enabled on their workstation or their laptop? Do they have is their EDR endpoint up to date and configured? Is two-factor enabled with the IDP, right? And then, of course, if they have mobile devices and we have an MDM vendor, is that enabled also? And so instead of me having to log into these various tools to query or pull that, we're simply going to leverage Swimlane to connect to those various third-party APIs to pull that policy status, right? And so when that policy status is ran, I get results back from those various tools, right? So in this case, for Frederick's machine, we have encryption already enabled. We've got EDR, two-factor. The only gap is there is not an MDM policy or MDM enabled on their device, right? So the next step here is to provide that enforcement. So again, leveraging the API tools, there's a couple ways that I can do that enforcement. I can either have direct connectivity to that MDM solution in order to perform that enforcement, or I can have the task actually create a ticket requesting that that action is performed. And then once I get those results back, I can then update my HR platform that they have performed that enforcement and that they do have green checks across the board for all those policy requirements in order for them to do the international travel. So again, this is a very high level one, but very specific use case that we can build using low code automation. As far as the user UI UX experience, let me actually just pivot to that for the team so you can actually see how we're able to build out this user experience. So again, there's two parts to my application. There's the UI UX, which you saw in those previous use cases with the threat hunting and the credentialed monitors, the full case management workflow with phishing and threat intel. We talked about the very beginning, we have what's called Swimlane solution packages or SSPs. That's content that's pre-built, pre-configured, and available for customers of Swimlane to leverage so they do not have to build something from scratch. However, in this case, this is one of those use cases where I wanted to be able to build something custom for Bank Mega, but I wanted to make it very low code. And so within my builder, I can simply have a selection of various field types that I can drag and drop, whether it's sections, tabs, certain field types, how I want the user experience to be once that's built out. And then the second part to that is simply just building out my workflow to do those checks, right? So as I get that ticket that comes in, that's going to map to those fields within Swimlane. I'm then going to perform those conditional checks to understand, do I have a username? Query my IDP or identity provider to pull those details in. Once I have those details and I have an action button to actually execute the lookup, I'm then just calling those various actions to those tools to get that additional telemetry or data back into Swimlane in order to perform those enforcement actions on the behalf of that end user making that request.
So you can see here, I mean, go ahead. There's questions. I'll stop.
Yeah, so I've got a question about, I've built this thing in low code, which is great. How do I test it? Like I'm thinking, how do I do automated testing and regression testing and that kind of thing to make sure A, it's correct, and B, it stays correct, and that I can do the same things that I do with code, version control and tracking who changed what when, that sort of thing.
Great question. So let me show you how you do the testing first initially. So within every single task, I can actually have a built-in debugger that I can run against either hard-coded data that I plug in, right? So I could plug in a domain and run that task to get the value. Or optionally, if I have test records that already exist in Swimlane, I could simply just create a new record or select an existing record to test that task against. So I can actually see the output and the results of that task to ensure that it's properly running and not failing. From a editing perspective, within the actual builder, right? So if I go back to my travel form here and I take a look at the history, I can see an audit trail of every individual. This is kind of boring because it's just me building it, but an audit trail of every individual that has made modifications to this workflow and or application associated to this specific use case, right? So as I extend that, I can actually see fields that were modified, tasks that were modified, what the version is specifically, the layout changes, et cetera. So everything can be monitored from a track and change perspective, but then also we have a built-in debugger to be able to test or validate all of those tasks before you actually move that to a production or a live task. Does that answer your question?
Partly. So that's sort of development. That's how I can basically run some stuff and test it on my own. I'm more thinking about automated testing and particularly regression testing. So I've changed something, and if I don't remember to go and check that it still works, I want the system to be able to go, yes, you are definitely pulling in data and it still works the way it's supposed to, and automatically prevent it from breaking production if I've inadvertently made a change that doesn't work, that breaks the build. And also just other things like code review and standard processes that we use in software development.
Yeah, so there's a couple different ways here. Let me see if I can pull up a particular record. Cody, while I'm pulling this up, if there's any context you want to add.
Yeah, I mean, one of the things that you don't see obviously here is that everything that you're seeing from an application perspective, for the most part, except for those integrations, which we talked about being Python, are actually JSON objects, right? So if you're thinking about your environment from like a Git flow perspective, the ability to kind of save these things off and use them in that way. And Bryon hasn't really went through because it's kind of more on the administration side, but the ability to import and export everything into and out of Swimlane from an application perspective. And as much as we love our UI, we've built it for a security analyst, so it's obviously full dark mode here. But everything is available through like a full Swag Respect API, right? So as people start using Swimlane in a real-time perspective, they're able to import and export applications. They do that via the API. We do that with pretty standard JSON objects to support that. And within the application, as Bryon mentioned, there's some debugging and things along those lines. So there's if it's dev test prod, or if it's being able to save stuff out from a code into a code repository, we can export that content out. So,
yep. And then the only thing I would add is, when an integration fails, like how can I be notified or aware that it is, like something broke? So we essentially have a health and maintenance operations application that monitors for those failed integrations. So if an integration does fail, it'll tell me, well, what was the record specifically that failed, right? When did it fail? What were the affected records? What was the integration name that failed? And then, of course, a full dump of the actual error itself. So, from a version control perspective, or managing, the dev lifecycle of, dev, QA, prod, we had those export, import capabilities of the tasks. But when they're actually in there and running, if you make a modification and you want to be able to see beyond just initial debugging, if it failed, you can see it here. So when it's running through that workflow, you would see these error logs of when it failed and why it failed for additional troubleshooting.
So this is for Bryon and Cody. This doesn't actually, and I think I've mentioned this before, you guys agreed with me, this doesn't actually replace any of the existing tooling in the SOC, right? For any of the existing tooling. This augments and helps them the ability to stitch together events from one tool to another, like as you would take information from one and pivot into another tool, and from there pivot into another tool to enrich data and eventually add your details to your case. I guess you probably wouldn't have a SOC if you only had one tool, like a SIM or something. So I'm trying to think, like, what is the minimum amount of tools that customers call you for and say, hey, look, we don't have any developers on staff. We just can't stitch all these tools together. And that's why we're interested in your product. We want the people who are awesome analysts to also be able to click and build the automations. What's the minimum tools? I mean, are they doing that for a SOC that has 3 primary tools and a threat intel feed? Or is it 10, 12, 15 tools? And that's where they start leaning on you guys and say, this is too much. We need to go with a product that can handle this for us.
So I think there's a couple things that, folks are realizing right now. One is the amount of infrastructure that's inside of their environment before they ever get to security tools is pretty overwhelming, right? So a lot of folks that are building, we'll say, a new SOC, or rethinking how they're going to build their operations team, or just how are they going to apply automation across their whole organization, are really thinking about automation first. So, it's not, I have to have, an EDR and a SIM and a firewall before I ever need this. There's kind of 2 things. One is, if the tools that I'm buying are not, API first, if they're not feature rich from an API perspective, they're probably not a good fit. And having an automation solution in place in advance actually really forces the buying decision to ensure that they have kind of a robust. The future of security is not a bunch of UIs, it's a bunch of automation and configurations code. So that's a forcing function for them. The other is that, as we've adopted cloud, as the underlying operating systems and the tooling that's available from our infrastructure providers include security components, there's a lot of, you could do a ton of security with Sysmon. I mean, just having Sysmon running and using that information, we have folks that are really saying, what can if I take an automation tool in first and I use my network infrastructure, my endpoint infrastructure, my identity infrastructure, like how much can I really cover from a, we'll call it a cyber defense matrix perspective, if you want to use that example that was built by Sunil Yu. What can I cover with automation in my existing infrastructure? And then where do I have to buy tools to go around that in order to, fill any gaps from a visibility perspective, right? If it's threat hunting, if it's data, maybe with infrastructure, I'm not getting good contextual data from a data loss prevention perspective. So there's a lot that you can do. There's probably not a minimum requirement. If you have a compute environment, you really can leverage automation. It's just, you have to think about how do I leverage my existing infrastructure in a way that actually gives me security visibility that might not always be like the normal way of doing it. It's very easy to go buy an endpoint tool, but there's a lot of capability sitting inside of your standard Microsoft endpoint to do some pretty robust security.
Yeah, I was just thinking of the some of the popular SIMs that are out there. Splunk, ArcSight, if you dare, and Elk, Elastic Products. These companies, they're trying to become the whale. They're trying to do everything. And one of the things that they are now all doing, because they're all mature products, they're all incorporating some automation. They're all incorporating third-party integrations, plugins, things of the like. So. Why not just go with a SIM vendor that sort of has everything all in one?
Right. Yeah, I think there's a couple reasons for that. One is that focus, right? As an organization, the SIM market is terribly competitive. The ability to aggregate, search, index information, you still need that, right? I mean, for compliance perspectives and things like that, absolutely necessary. So having that in place is probably going to be there, right? Why wouldn't you use that? I would say by and large, that is generally kind of a fire and forget, security mechanism, right? I saw an alert, I run a script. And that is automation. It's pure sense. I mean, if you're a Unix administrator, that's automation. That's what you did. You wrote scripts. But what we're seeing is that from a security ops perspective, the first time you see something and the threat intelligence that's associated with that isn't always the indicative of, is this benign or malicious? So take an example like SolarWinds, right? You had a really sophisticated attacker that was using bespoke infrastructure to attack individual organizations. And if you saw that alert and you got that information back, and you checked your threat intelligence, there's a chance that it would have said it was benign, right? And if you're running kind of, I would say, a rudimentary automation system, which is a lot of times tied to something like a SIM, you would run the integration, you would check the intelligence, it would say it's benign, it would move on. The nice thing about using something that's robust like Swimlane is that we'll come back and check. We'll check tonight, we'll check tomorrow, we'll check 3 months from now. We have folks that are doing that. They'll look at a phishing email from 3 months ago, recheck the threat intelligence and say, oh man, like this actually is benign. My source for identifying malicious behavior or malicious infrastructure was just lagging. There was latency in the system because information sharing or the service provider that I'm using. So if you're using, I would say, rudimentary automation, kind of fire and forget automation, you're not going to get that rehydration of these cases. And there's a good chance that you're going to miss things. And that's the way that we see kind of adversaries moving is to use much more unique infrastructure to attack environments. So the time for propagation of intelligence between different organizations through an ISAC can be delayed, not always, but can be. So I think there's a lot of reasons why just, kind of executing a rote automation at point in time really gives you a false sense of security. So sorry, that was a little ranty, but I feel strongly about it.
No, that's great. There's nothing wrong with feeling strong about your own products. I appreciate it.
Yeah, and I would probably just add to that too. I mean, you're talking about security operations are very singular use cases, right? So, I mean, not all data sources or not all data goes to a SIM, right? I mean, we're talking about workflows and use cases that go beyond SecOps, right? I mean, there's SecOps and there's security automation and there's enterprise automation. So, I mean, we're working to build use cases and automation with legal departments, with HR departments for onboarding, offboarding, legal workflows, compliance workflows. So again, it's not always data driven, right? Like We have some customers that don't even have SIMs. Like they literally get so much data that's typically just coming in via a manual trigger, like a ticket's opened up, somebody gets on call via pager duty, a phone call, and email. So the source isn't always a SIM, is that trigger. So when Cody kind of elaborated earlier, where there can be one or multiple sources that pivots and executes that particular use case or workflow, it doesn't always start from down or upstream from an alert. Essentially, I guess is my point. So.
The other thing that's really interesting is it relates to kind of alert, response time. So mean time to respond and mean time to mitigate, dwell time, all those fun metrics is, a lot of times folks are measuring that from the time that they're notified to the time that they take action. But if you think about what the life cycle of telemetry is from a security perspective, you generally have something way downstream, some type of sensor that's going to identify something. It's going to roll it up to a centralized manager. Centralized manager is going to send off that to logging. Logging is going to index it together. They're going to run heuristics, analytics, anomaly detection, whatever they're going to do. It's going to kick out an alert. But a lot of times, that the alert that initially happened is high fidelity. I don't need all of that processing in order to take an action. So do I need it for historical record? Do I need it for searching, hunting, whatever it might be? Absolutely. But there's a lot of alerts, to Bryan's point, that are not sourcing out of the SIM. They're actually just coming from, direct high fidelity spots, and actioning them immediately is actually helping with that overall dwell time. So that's super important for organizations. And again, to his point, not everything is, sometimes it's literally someone coming into a form and saying, I want access to this third-party website. It's blocked through the proxy right now. I want to add it. And as an analyst, I get that as a ticket. But what if I could take that, port and protocol request and run it through all the threat intelligence analysis I would a phishing email, and tell the analyst, like, hey, everything that we know about this right now in this moment in time is that this is a safe URL or domain to give access to this person to. So that has nothing to do with a SIM. And generally, when you see automation tied to SIM, it's really tied to a logging information and alerts that arise from that logging information.
When you go from the low-code view to the activity, is there anything in here that says go through the verification stage, have someone review it? Because I can just see someone writing something that says, let's just turn everything off for that person, and then runs it across 20,000 people.
Absolutely.
What's in here that prevents that level of abuse?
Yeah, so there's a couple things here. One is generally you're working with somebody who understands the process, but the mistakes can be made. So the nice thing is that
you just pinned it. They understand the process, therefore they're going to abuse it. That's my concern.
Yeah. So like any other system, there is somebody who has universe, root access to something. And there's audit logs. So you can export the audit logs out of Swimlane. You can monitor for that, which turns into a Swimlane use case, ironically, which we've seen. But the process is we have separation of duties within the platform, right? There's administrators, not administrators. And generally you can do that. And in addition to, most folks are going to do a dev test prod progression of use cases if they're doing things in a best practice form. So generally between the separation of duties from an administrator perspective versus a non-administrator, and then also using, proper escalation of things into production, that's where that's in place. Now, if you just have a single Swimlane instance and you have it all, God rights to that environment, you could abuse it, but there would be an audit log associated with that. But you could also probably do the same thing directly in those other tools, because you have to have access to all those third-party systems to make that a reality. You have to have a service account in all these other tools. So that would also be another point where you see some checks and balances.
So actually, I don't see checks and balances there, and I'm not sure I quite got your answer.
Okay.
It sounds like in order to do the low-code part, you need to be an admin.
So basically, in order to turn it on, you have to be an admin. We can also make read-only access, so you could provide or recommend.
So is there a developer mode on this one? I can just give people the ability to write all these things and create them, then have an approval done by, let's say a second approver approach where it gets reviewed, and I have a second approver before it can even be promoted into reality.
From an administrative perspective, if you have admin rights.
I guess you're missing my point. I don't want an admin to be able to write code,
Okay.
low code or any code. I don't want them to be able to import anything or do anything. I want a developer to do that understands what they're doing. An admin may or may not. Admin just runs things. He doesn't necessarily write things. I want those gone through. I don't want an oops to happen. I want that to be reviewed with a second approver, and then I want that to be promoted, and I want a limit on how often this thing goes off to an API, because there need to have some sort of built-in limit. If I have to go off to something more than probably 10 times to the same API, now we have a real problem, because now I could be doing a lot more damage across more than a major subsystem.
So the way the customers typically do that is they do that through the content promotion process.
So how do you do the content promotion? How is that approval done?
So basically you would have an export of a use case or an application is what we would call it from a configuration perspective that would come out of the system, and it would be put into, it would go from dev to prod. So it generally is reviewed, make sure that it works, it's exported by an administrator, not by the developer who created it in the dev environment, and then it's run in production.
So, but where are the limits? Are there any limits on the number of API calls these things can make, et cetera?
So you can like configure things like thresholding by how the plugins. So some plugins you can have that as a drop-down option. And typically that's set in circumstances where you're worried about maybe I have to pay for so many API calls. So you can put some thresholding in. That's usually part of the plugin configuration itself. It's not a platform-wide configuration.
Okay, thank you.
I have a non-tech question for you. I know we're at Tech Field Day, but I have a non-tech question. I have a number of customers who, I have a networking background. I have a number of customers who the network department and the security department don't get along. So to think that a system is going to be implemented to either shut down network ports if it identifies something bad, or send a change of authorization to a NAC system if it detects something, that type of stuff keeps network managers up at night. How do you help sell these automation systems or bridge that gap between security and network, or security and systems administrators? Maybe it's relationship counseling or group counseling or whatever you want to call it, but having the network manager say no to that could cost you guys a sale. So how do you help with that evolution in those processes, and being able to automate to the very end of the incident?
Yeah, absolutely. We do trust exercises. No, I'm just kidding. I'm being sarcastic. Trust fall exercises. No, we've seen this before, right? So, I think back to a customer government agency, SOC and NOC were separate. The SOC wanted to implement basically the ability to add IP addresses to a particular ACL. And obviously the network team's like, no, you can't do that. We do that. You can send me a ticket. But the security team was concerned about the speed at which that happens because they have a big ticket queue. So what they did, in kind of order to break down this, is that we won't implement any changes to that ACL unless you approve it. And we're going to give you access into Swimlane, and we're going to give you a button, and you can come in and review it. And if you've reviewed it, you push this button, and we agree that it's going to push that in. Eventually, they got really sick of pushing that button. So it was almost a forcing function where it's like, okay, I've seen this happen 1,800 times. It's worked every time I ask for it. I agree with the thresholding you've put in place. I'm really sick of coming in here and doing it. I will allow you to change that from a push button option to an automatic workflow option. And now that happens automatically. So sometimes you have to kind of go through that, not to be facetious, but a trust exercise through the tool. But that's sometimes how that happens. A lot of times it becomes an escalation where, two folks that are responsible for the tools don't agree, but their leadership does, and they'll actually make that happen. But, if you have to do it through the tooling itself, it's possible. So.
Yeah, that's perfect. I almost envision a Thunderdome situation between network managers and security managers, which could be fun in itself. But yeah, it's, I guess, just build up trust over time.
Yeah, I mean, the conversation usually goes like, "There's no way in hell I'm going to let you make changes in my environment without my approval." But the quick follow up to that is, I'll stop sending you those tickets, and then you're going to get, you'll get somebody's attention because they're like, "I'm really sick of doing that." So that's generally, there's some give and take there.
Cody and Bryon, this is another perhaps non-technical question. Let's talk about licensing, sort of scalability, and what does it take for this thing to run? Is it cloud hosted? Is it on-prem? Does it need a Linux server? Can it be run as a VM? All that sort of good technical specs that we need to know before purchasing and standing this up.
Yeah, so I mean, this is the nice part, is you got a lot of flexibility. If you want to run our SaaS offering, that's available. If you want to run in your own private cloud, that's fine. If you want to deploy it into your own, EKS or AKS environment, you can do that as well. If you need air gap because you're a government agency or a energy or utility company that's doing OT, these are all options. So the nice part is there's a lot of flexibility from an architecture perspective, and you kind of run it where you need to. We see a lot of folks that want to have it in-house, and we see folks that don't want to manage infrastructure. We see both of those. So it really just depends on, what your, ambitions from a system administration perspective are. If you want none, SaaS. If you really need it in-house because you feel more comfortable, then that's totally viable as well.
And maybe I missed it or you didn't answer, but how does the licensing for this go? Is it annual? Is it per event, per API integration? Sort of how does that work?
It's named users, so it's the number of folks actually come into the system. So it's really about folks that are coming in and leveraging the platform.
Okay, so like number of I would call them administrators, but I know that there's a sticky wicket around here calling someone an admin. But number of users, right? Number of logins, I guess.
Yeah, basically number of logins. That's correct.
Got it.
Yeah, essentially named users in the platform.
Yeah, so actually, I'm curious. I think this is a really cool platform. I've seen some similar things in the past. Similar is kind of a stretch as far as case management as well as automation. I wonder, since you mentioned this works offline, I wonder how we can package this up. And I guess what I mean is, let's say I'm responding to an incident in another state. Right. And I got to fly out tomorrow morning. How do I take this on a laptop, or how do I take this on a low powered Intel NUC or something and have it have some I don't want to spend all my time there on site setting this up. I want it to be ready out of the box. How do I go from zero to usable?
So typically what you'd see, I would say that's an atypical use case, but it's not unheard of, right? You have incident response folks that have a set of playbooks that they're going to use. So you can run this on, smaller infrastructure, but obviously scalability is limited. So what you would see is someone take that laptop, they'd have a set of workflows and reports, probably for more tactical, short period of time incident response. So how do I pull back a bunch of EDR data? How do I, and the nice thing is we already have those integrations, right? So if you have to tie it to Encase, you need to tie into your, Sentinel-1 environment, you want to connect to Elastic. Now I have the ability to run my workflow really quick. So obviously you got to get those service accounts and permissions and all that fun stuff. But once that's in place, you can actually connect that, you can run it on, obviously all of our development staff runs this on, their laptops. You're just obviously throughput, data storage, processing power is going to be diminished, right? So that's really what it comes down to. There's nothing about server architecture or cloud architecture that precludes you from running this on, smaller hardware. It's just, you have to have realistic expectations of how that's going to work. You're not going to do, 4 or 5 million events a day on that environment. You're going to probably be using it to execute a set of incident response tasks that's going to make your life a lot better and a lot faster. But, hopefully the customer has something in place, but if not, you could do that. Now, I would say that's not a traditional use case, not unheard of, but not a super traditional one.
Yeah. And how much storage does this take up? So I understand, this is not a SIM, right? It's not ingesting your logs. It's not ingesting NetFlow, right? Instead, it's just, I call it the plumbing between tools. But how much data does it actually retain? So I know how much storage you have to allocate for something like this.
I mean, classic IT response, it depends. I mean, if you have an application that's got 3 fields and they're all text fields, you can save basically a lifetime's worth of data. If all of a sudden you're dropping packet captures and zip files and things into your cases as artifacts for, whatever your use case might be, obviously the amount of storage that you need to go up. So we have some calculation tools that we use to say, how much information you're storing, what types of information is that, how long do you want to keep it? 30 days, 90 days, a year, 5 years, 7 years. And that's really going to drive your consumption. So it comes really down to, what do you want to keep, for how long do you want to keep it? And then we obviously have some archiving mechanisms within the product to, offload that after it passes through thresholds. So sorry not to give you a specific answer, but it really does depend.
That's okay. That's okay. So, but I guess the answer to the question that I think maybe I got from you was, you're only storing the case data, right? You're not doing a full ingest of logs and threat intelligence and stuff like that and storing that long term. You're just storing the case data. So it depends on what the case data is being created with, I guess, and uploaded. And like you said, zip files, artifacts, memory dumps, PCAPs, et cetera, could grow it a little bit, but that's the data that you're storing.
Typically, a lot of folks will refer to it as metadata, and it really depends. It's not like you said, it's not all the log data. It's not your entire threat intelligence store, but we do see folks that are, bringing in a lot of information, storing and, managing, I would call curated threat intelligence inside of the platform. They are bringing in logging data associated with particular cases. They're bringing in packet captures, but no, we don't have all the net flow. We don't have all the logs. We don't have all that. It's the things that are important during that window in time in which you're doing an investigation. And that's actually a really interesting use case, is that, packet capture is really expensive from a storage perspective. So, not having to keep all of that information, from a huge archive perspective, being able to kind of precision request stuff and set it aside so that if you have your first in, first out buffer rolls over from a packet capture perspective, you still have what you need from an incident response perspective. So,
that's kind of like exactly what I was formulating in my mind while I was watching you guys do the demos is, when I see an event, I want to pull, the logs from that timestamp just to see what has happened across the network, plus or minus, give your value. I want to see the PCAP from the event that was thrown. I want to see the net flow records. I want to see any other tooling we have, right? Bro, Zeek, anything else. I want to see all of that, package it all up and present that to me. Right? Because I don't want to have to see an alert and then go to all those tools and get that data. And that's kind of where I feel like this tool would add value to something like what I would do, is it would actually prefetch all that data for me. Right? I already have an alert. I'm already going to look at these same 7 tools and get these same 7 artifacts. Go get them for me. Put them together.
And the nice part is it's doing it for you. You hopefully don't miss that window and it doesn't buffer out. And then when you do look at it, the nice part is, when Bryon showed case management for those different data types, right? If it's a packet capture or if it's memory or whatever it might be, we actually visualize those. We call them widgets inside of that. So now you're starting to give, maybe someone who's not as experienced at how to go run a particular tool to look at different data types and presenting in a way that's very consumable for them, using things like highlighting to draw their attention to things that they should. And that's coming from, your team and your environment, the institutional knowledge that you've built inside of your organization.